Hello, listeners. Welcome to Marie Lives the Horror. This is episode 36 of True Paranormal Ghost Stories. In tonight's episode, a ghostly neighbor makes their presence known. A caring mother says goodbye in a lovely way to her only child. And a terrifying entity attaches itself to a family after a visit to the cemetery goes horribly wrong. So without further ado, step into my horror chamber as we live the horror together. Number 1. My ghostly neighbor, Margaret. Here's just a little story from about 25 years ago. Where we lived, we became very friendly with an elderly neighbor called Margaret, who lived across the road from us. Margaret was divorced, lived there on her own, and had 2 sons who had gone to live abroad. She was a keen gardener and could be often seen tending to her front garden, which was a riot of color. Her house was in a very elevated position, which gave passers-by a good view of her lovely garden, and lots of people would stop for a chat. We talked most days on my way to school, taking and collecting my children. Sadly, she became ill with cancer. I visited her in the hospital, and she asked how her garden was looking. I told her the daffodils were all in bloom and it looked lovely. I hope whoever buys my house will care for the garden, she said. After she died, and about 6 months later, the house had been sold, and I was driving past and noticed the new lady owner mowing the grass. Smiling to myself, thinking Margaret will be pleased, I looked again and waved to Margaret, standing in the window watching. 10 seconds after I had done that, I was so shocked what I had just seen. Margaret is dead. How can that be her? Some months later, the house was back on the market. The lady who had bought the house told me, "I am not happy here. Some odd things had been happening. Items moved about, things going missing, and lights being turned on and off." I thought it best to say nothing about seeing Margaret watching her cutting the grass 6 months previously. I have never forgotten this experience and could see Margaret so clearly wearing an orange sweatshirt that she wore a lot. We moved ourselves not long after, so I don't know if the new owners have had any odd happenings in Margaret's old home. Number 2. Early morning inventory. I should start by saying that while I do believe in ghosts and the paranormal, I believe there are plenty of things that can be explained once you take a step back and think worth a clear mind. With that being said, there is no logical explanation that I can think of for this story. This story takes place at my old job, which is a restaurant/bar event hall on a military base. I was there for 8 years, starting off as a dishwasher and made my way up to an admin. The building was originally built like in the 80s, but they built on from it. To the point is hilariously noticeable from the inside if you know what you're looking at. Now, over those 8 years, we've had plenty of employees and customers talk about how weird things happen in the old part of the building, but nothing too crazy, like things moving slightly on their own that made you think that maybe the AC was hitting it, or feeling like someone was right behind you with how steps sounded. I've had smaller moments like that during my time there. Nothing too crazy, though before this incident, I thought it was just in my head or something else. I realized very intensely that I was wrong one day. It was stupid early in the morning, going in at like 4, and I was in the building alone. It was the end of the month, so it was inventory time. We also had a delivery coming in at around 6, though they have been known to show up earlier. I started inventory the day before, but my manager and I figured that I could come in early, finish up inventory, put up the image, and I could go home early. That was a deal to me because it was Tuesday. I was off Wednesday, and Thursday and Friday were holidays, so we were closed. I had all the doors open from where we stored up our liquor, the old side of the building, all the way to the loading dock, on the other side of the building in the newer half. I did this so, should the driver arrive early, he would be able to find his way to me. It takes roughly less than 2 minutes to walk from the loading dock to the liquor room, if you walk at a casual pace with all the turns you take to move around. I had my music blaring inside the liquor room, which was a freezer room they used in the old building, which echoed inside the room. As I was counting, I heard a man's voice clearly say, "Hello?" I had been there for roughly an hour, so I thought it was the delivery truck driver who was looking for me. I answered back and walked out looking for the driver. Except, when I searched around, not only was there no delivery truck, I was still the only person there. Now you would be thinking that it must have been the music I listened to, but I was listening to some game's instrumental soundtrack, so that couldn't be it. Shaking my head, thinking I was hearing things, I just went back to count. What happened next was the first time I experienced this sense of primal fear. The room got real cold, even in the thick jacket I wore, and I was filled with a feeling of unease. Suddenly, the sound of boots stomping down hard in the wooden flooring came from down the hallway and came towards me. It was at this fast walking pace and with a sense of purpose. I made some sort of noise as I dug deeper into the room, pressing up against the wall. I raised the leg up and covered my upper body with my arms, as if that would do something, as those footsteps reached the door of the room and then stopped. It was still cold, but once I saw that nothing was there, I bolted out of the room and to my car, waiting for the next person to show up. Eventually, my manager showed up and I tell her the story. She knew that I was pretty hard to startle, even with employees sneaking up on me, so when she saw the fear I had, she believed me. Plus side is that after that, no one was allowed to be in the building alone during early morning or late night. Cut to my 7th year there, and the newest manager coming in. We go to the old side of the building, talking about a bunch of things with another coworker. In the middle of the talk, she stops, looks off to the side, and says, "This building is haunted, isn't it?" No one told her a thing about the ghosts of the weird things that have happened there. Needless to say, I'm glad I'm not in that building anymore. Number 3. A fellow book lover. When I was 20, oh so long ago, I had a very tiny apartment. It was one half of a duplex built in the 50s. My landlord was a distant cousin, so knew the history of the property. One afternoon, after cleaning and doing laundry, I decided to relax with my favorite book and a cup of coffee. I was sitting on my daybed. Place was too small for a couch and a bed. Reading while my coffee was brewing. The book was a hardback, special edition that I read so many times the spine was broken. That meant I could lay the book down still open and it wouldn't close. I heard the last gurgles of my coffee pot, so I put my book on the daybed, still open, get up and go get myself a cup of coffee. I turn around to go back to my bed, and I see her. She was in her 20s, wearing a long brown skirt and a green top. The style of clothes and hair was late 30s, early 40s. She was sitting on my daybed with her legs tucked up under her in stocking feet. Just a relaxing pose. She was leaning over, reading my book. She looked up, saw me, gave me an impish whoopsie you saw me grin, and disappeared. I just stood there, staring at where she had been sitting. I stood there so long when I finally came back to myself, my cup of coffee was cold. I immediately called my mom and told her what happened. She was solid. I couldn't see through her. I thought at first she must be connected somehow to the property, but the duplex and surrounding area hadn't been built until the 50s, and her dress and hair was from an earlier time. I never saw her again, and have had no other encounters of that type, but I remember everything about it till this day. I wasn't scared. Nothing about the encounter scared me or made me feel uncomfortable. In fact, I lived there for a couple more years. I did every night before going to bed take that book and open it to a new page and put it on my kitchen table, just in case she wanted to keep reading it. Number 4. The Clinic. Hey everyone, first time poster. I'm in one of those storytelling moods again, and I thought I would share with everyone what myself and several other coworkers experienced. To start off, I am in the US military and worked at a naval air station that is in the middle of nowhere in Nevada. It is the base where they filmed the Top Gun movies in the 80s. I was a corpsman there at the time of my experience and worked in the clinic. For a week at a time, every month or so, at night I had duty to make sure things were locked up properly and immunizations were kept cool. Real simple and pointless shit to keep us busy. The clinic had a patient waiting area. In the middle, surrounding it, is a pharmacy and lab, as well as dental and medical home port, with immunizations way in the back. One night, while I was on duty, I felt a strange presence, like I wasn't alone, and I felt eyes on me. While I was doing my rounds, mind you, it was dark enough to where you can't see, but light enough to where you can make out shapes and shadows. At the front desk, for medical home port, there is a phone alarm that goes off when one of the emergency cords are pulled in the bathrooms. I was in the back, closing all the doors, due to people leaving them open during the workday. I hear the phone go off. The alarm is loud and has an earth-shattering tone. Being the only person in the clinic at the time, I practically shit myself. I shakenly walk to the front desk and check the phone. It said E6 IMZ. I let out one single word, and it was right. Naturally, I walk over to the immunization department and open its door. Inside is a desk, the refrigerator with the IMMZ, a back room with a patient bed, another desk, and a bathroom. Above the bathroom is a flashing light indicating the cord was pulled. I opened the door. No lights were on. The cord was not pulled. As I turned around, the door I used to enter the IMMZ department slams shut. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I ran out, leaving IMMZ unlocked. I quickly locked up the clinic and got the hell out of there for the night. Epilogue. I told my coworkers about this experience the next day, and they weren't surprised. They say there is a little girl who runs through the halls late at night, as well as a man who reads a paper in the waiting room. The dental tech also stated that the lights in dental constantly turn themselves on. Every time I had duty there, I feel like I am being watched. More stories are to come. Number 5. My mom communicated with me after passing. My dear old mom died in 1996. I'd nipped her out from her bedside for a quick ciggy. When I returned, she had died. I did all the necessary checks and went to inform the nurse on the ward. The staff made me a cup of tea while they sorted out my mom. This is the UK. Tea is the correct drink for such events. I returned into the side room to say my goodbyes to a lovely lady. This sounds really strange, but the room seemed full of people. Not visible, obviously, but the place seemed very, very busy. As I gave her a kiss, I was suddenly aware that she was saying hello to her mother. Writing this down and reading it seems so strange. The week between her death and the funeral was very busy. As I am her only adopted child, I was cleaning and tidying her flat, and I nipped through the kitchen to the bins outside. As I did so, I looked to see how the washing was doing. The machine was in mid-cycle, i.e. full of water and turning slowly, but the washing machine door was open. I closed it immediately. There was no water on the floor and the cycle completed. The machine had never done this before and worked faultlessly for another 20 years. The Friday before the funeral, the following Monday, I returned home on a glorious June evening. As soon as I walked in the door, I thought, someone is in here. It wasn't a frightening thing, more of a surprise, really. I opened the living room door, and I saw the figure of my mom, rather like someone in the Star Trek transporter, standing next to her chair. It was all very brief and not at all worrying. The following day, the white Bedelia outside the front window was covered in red admiral butterflies. I could barely see the shrub. Again, this number of butterflies never visited subsequently. I know our senses are heightened at times of loss, but I'm not given to flights of fancy like this, or indeed, flights of butterflies. Number 6. Scared out of my mind as a child. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote about seeing an old man on the garage roof on my childhood family home in Manchester. After that rather harrowing encounter, I never saw him again. I never dreamt about him again or even really thought about him. I did have another experience in the same house a couple of years later, which frightened me even more. This one stayed with me from the night it happened as a 9-year-old all the way into adulthood. I still think about it regularly, not just because it genuinely shook me to my core, but also because I wasn't the only one to experience it in the house. As a child, I was very adventurous in my outlook towards fear and thrill seeking. I'd watch every horror film I could get my hands on. I'd read the scariest novels in my parents' library. I'd throw myself willingly at anything that might have a chance of scaring me. Nothing ever really came close. Once I got into the upper ages of my primary school, I started going out with my friends more and staying out later. My parents were very relaxed with my curfew. They knew me well enough to know I'd never put myself in danger or get into trouble, so I was genuinely allowed to stay out later than the other kids in my group, who had to be home around 7 p.m. The park we used to hang out around was further from my house than anyone else's, so I always ended up alone walking home. One night, I impulsively decided to take a different, longer route home. That took me past a cemetery. It was the same cemetery that a few of my relatives were buried in, so I was pretty comfortable being there. I stopped to look at the black gates guarding the entrance. They were huge, easily 3 times my height, and were in pretty poor condition. It must have been years since they were painted or had the rust scraped off of them. The gates were covered in moss, and the spikes mounting them had pierced an assortment of different colored leaves, and spiderwebs covered the tips of them, with threads connecting each spike. I wanted to go in, I don't know why, but something felt as though it was pulling me in. The gates were barred shut in the evenings, so my only way in was to climb. I eventually talked myself into doing it. I was more worried about someone seeing me do it than any danger that might befall me while attempting to get over them. I was a fairly athletic kid, so getting over was no issue, and I was certain I hadn't been seen, even though my weight made the gates rattle loudly and violently. Once I was inside the cemetery, I just walked around, reading the names and ages of the people buried there, taking in when they were born and when they died. Like most cemeteries, the newer plots were at the front, so I started heading deeper to find older graves. I must have been walking for about 20 minutes when I saw a very unique looking headstone. It was about 10 feet tall and was shaped like an angel holding a baby with a young child standing beside her. The faces that had been carved into the stone had been weathered away, leaving them featureless. They were eerie to look at in those surroundings, and with the sun having long since set. There was no noise except the rustling of the trees, the occasional sound of a car driving past the entrance. I knelt at the grave and tried to make out the name on the graves. There were three, and they had been dead for a long time. The name at the top of the list, I refused to type it, was clearly the mother given her age. The other two were younger, children. The elder of the two had died at the age of 8, while the youngest had only lived for a year. The dates of their deaths were the same. All three had passed away at the same time. As a 9-year-old, I understood how odd that was, but not that it couldn't have likely meant they died in a tragic accident or in a murder/suicide. While I was observing the gravestone, I heard a branch snap in the distance behind me. I immediately jolted around and began scanning to see what had caused it. It was tough to see, but I couldn't make anything out. While my back was turned on the grave, the hairs on my neck tingled, like someone had blown on them. It was enough to tell me I shouldn't be there and I needed to leave. I ran towards the exit and scaled the gates without worrying how much noise I was making. Once I was over the gates, I began making my way home. Occasionally, I'd glance back into the cemetery through the cast iron bars. I was being followed. I was sure of it. The graveyard was pitch black, but I could still make out the silhouette of a person walking alongside me much deeper in. I quickened my pace, but the shape kept up, and it now looked closer than before, like it was walking closer towards me, but also still moving sideways. I ran across the road without looking. A car had to slam its brakes to avoid hitting me. The driver beeped her horn and glowered at me. I paid her no attention. I was only thinking about getting home as quickly as possible. I ran the rest of the way. By the time I got home, it was pretty late. My mom told me to get washed up and go straight to bed. I did as I was told. I wanted to put my time in the graveyard behind me and move on to a new day. While I was asleep, I kept dreaming about the cemetery and the silhouette that had moved alongside me. Then I dreamt about the silhouette walking through the streets of my neighborhood and heading straight for my house. In the dream, the silhouette headed straight into my house, up the stairs, and into my room. I woke from the dream and stared at my ceiling. I could see a small amount of light coming through the door. It was ajar. I never slept with my door open and once shut. It was impossible for the door to open without turning the handle. My room as deathly silent as usual, but I could hear someone walking around in the infinite darkness that was the floor space in my room when the curtains were shut. I peeked through the gap in the railing of my bed and could see the silhouette standing by my wardrobe, thanks to the light coming through the small opening of my door. I shut my eyes and tried to regain my composure. I could hear it moving around. The noise stopped, and the usual silence of my room at night returned briefly. It was broken by the sound of my bunk bed steps groaning under the weight of someone climbing them. I heard the first step, then the second one, and then the third. I opened my eyes to look and saw the shape looking back in my direction from the top of the steps. For a split second, I was transfixed. It wasn't a silhouette anymore. It was a woman wearing a black dress with a veil covering her face. Her face had no features, just like the headstone I'd stopped to look at the cemetery. Even without eyes, I could tell she was looking at me. I threw the covers over my head and hoped that would be enough to hide from her. It wasn't. I felt her weight shift from the steps onto the bed itself. I felt her edging closer to me. I could feel the weight of her on top of me. It was suffocating, crushing. She moved in the most unnatural way possible, more like a snake than a human. She was shifting up the bed and closer to my face until she stopped. I knew her face and mine were now level. I shut my eyes again and told myself, no matter what happened, I would not open them again. My covers were pulled away, and I could feel her breath on me. It was odorless and cold, like the breeze that squeezes under a closed door. After what felt like an eternity had passed, I couldn't keep my eyes closed anymore. I opened them and looked at her. She wasn't featureless now. I could see her. I could see her old, freckled skin, her pointed nose and thin lips. Her eyes were closed, so tightly they looked sealed shut. Only a second had passed before I let out the biggest scream I had ever managed in my entire life. I wanted to wake up every person on my street if possible. The woman slithered away without making a sound, without opening her eyes. I heard my parents' door open and the steps of my bed creaking. My mom and dad burst through my door and flicked my light on. As my eyes struggled to adjust, I could only make out the silhouettes of my parents and the woman. She walked right past them without them noticing. They spent the rest of the night reassuring me that it wasn't real. My dad took me back to my room after I started to calm down. I stepped in and saw a muddied footprint on my carpet. I pointed it out to my dad. He could see it too. I could see it on his face. He was uneasy about it. He suggested I stayed in their room. Eventually, I did manage to fall back to sleep. The next day, my parents agreed to swap our rooms around. I never experienced anything paranormal in that house again. We moved about 2 years later. I know my dad will have convinced my mom to swap the rooms. I didn't find out why until 3 years ago, when my dad passed away from cancer. In the evening of his funeral, me and my family stayed up, talking about our lives together. My mom mentioned what happened that night, and I told everyone who didn't already know the story. When I finished it, my youngest sister, who wasn't alive at the time this happened to me, and my mom shared a look. I asked them what it was for, and my mom told me that my dad had seen something almost identical to my experience. The same woman, the same feeling of her crawling towards him on the bed and just staring at him. He didn't tell me because he didn't want to frighten me more about the whole thing, and once we'd moved and time had gone by, it was no longer something to even talk about. According to my mom, he'd seen the woman wandering around the house many times after that night. My mom believes in the paranormal, but she has never experienced anything herself. But she always said me and my dad were very receptive to things like this. The woman has haunted my dreams so many times over the years, and even now, despite the fact I live hundreds of miles from that home, there are times where I feel like she is still watching me. There are times where I can see a silhouette on the other side of the road, only when I turn my head, there's nothing or no one there. To this day, I'm convinced that woman haunted my dad and is still doing the same to me. Apologies for the length of this. It's a long story to tell, but it wouldn't feel right not including what happened in the cemetery, as I'm convinced I brought her back with me and into my home. Hello, listeners. Thank you for listening to tonight's episode of True Paranormal Ghost Stories as you live the horror with me. If you have a true ghost story that you would like for me to feature in a future episode, please send a message to any of the contact links in the description. If you enjoyed tonight's video, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell to keep up with future content. Thanks again for listening, and as always, I am your host, Marie Lives the Horror.